How many of y'all in this room got politically active / awakened to politics because of the death of George Floyd? Please raise your hands. That's quite a significant amount of us. How many of y'all are inspired by figures like Malcolm X and Fred Hampton? Pretty much the whole room, as I guessed. Now, and who in here has a burning hatred for racism and all forms of oppression and want to put an end to them? Yes, comrades, that's everybody in this room, and millions of people around the US feel the exact same way. They hate racism and oppression with every single fiber of their being, but yet it's still a part of everyday life. As long as capitalism exists, its nasty tendrils will continue to prevail, and this will lead to further social explosions on this question. In preparation for social explosions, it is a task of Marxists to absorb the lessons of the preceding periods of heightened class struggle. And we look no further than the long history of black struggle in the United States, and particularly in the 50s and 70s, that hold a really important lessons for Marxists, which we'll get into. Throughout the course of the struggle, throughout the civil rights period, layers of the working class were radicalizing, and some even reached socialist conclusions. And there was a real potential for capitalism to be overthrown on a global scale. And I'll be mostly focusing on that tumultuous period from the 50s and 70s, why the black struggle is important today, and how it ties into the fight for socialism. So comrades, firstly, we must come to understand that for the victory of the social revolution, it will be impossible without paying attention to this question of the black struggle. But the reverse is also true. Without social revolution, black liberation would also be impossible. As Marxists, we are in complete opposition to racism and all forms of oppression. We fight for the utmost unity of the working class and fight against all of those poisons that seek to divide the class. We must come to understand that racism is ultimately a tool and a byproduct of the capitalist system, used to divide the workers amongst each other instead of focusing their efforts against the bosses, against the capitalists. The poison of racism prevails today precisely because of that, because it's useful for the ruling class, even though biologically, scientifically has been proven time and time again that race doesn't exist, the color of your skin doesn't play any fundamental character into the way that you'll act as a person. So race doesn't exist. That's a very important point to get across here. So I emphasize basically why the ruling class uses racism, but how does it come about? And it also is, are people just inherently racist, which is a classic liberal thing that's thrown around if people are just like, just inherently racist. That's another question that I want to pose to the discussion. But before I get into those questions, I want to, when I'm going to go through these periods of time, especially through slavery and onwards, some of these things I'm only going to be able to give historical context. I cannot possibly go through all of them. And I would definitely recommend our pamphlet on the Civil War to get more context of these periods. But I'm mostly going to be focusing on the 50s and 70s. So when Africans first arrived in North America forcefully in 1619, their status was more that of indentured servants. However, Africans, yes, always came in chains, and it was a very, very brutal process. But however, because of kind of the sort of stature or the status that they came as, they could become free after a period, usually was like around 4 to 7 years of indentured servitude. They could even own land and even own servants of them for themselves after serving their term, but that would be quite unlikely because the conditions were very, very brutal. And there's even records in the 1630s that plantation owners had expressed wanting African laborers, and even noted that Africans were a civilized and a docile people with knowledge and experience with tropical cultivation. So you could see here, not yet demonizing completely African Americans or Africans on their skin color as a mark of social inferiority. That would come a little bit later. And here's the thing, though. The ruling class in this period needed a large permanent labor force to work the vast amounts of land in order to recognize massive profits. However, in this early period of capitalist development, a quote-unquote homemade proletariat hadn't been created yet, and it's a very violent process. Britain went through that. It was a very violent process, but that didn't exist yet, so slavery provided that cheap labor needed to work on these vast amounts of land. So we come into the 1690s in this period, after Bacon's Rebellion, which happened in 1676, which had saw unity of the oppressed blacks and whites unite against the rich plantation owners. There was a more systematic and accelerated approach that was taking place into transforming Africans from indentured servants into chattel slaves eventually. So that's the material basis for which racism comes about. It's not, again, this thing that people are just inherently have. So that basically answers that sort of liberal lie. People are not inherently racist, but it comes out of definite material conditions. And these are the material conditions that basically were posed. is the fact that they needed a permanent large labor force, and they needed to divide the oppressed. That is where the basis of racism comes from. And that's where you see this transformation of Africans were no longer considered civilized and a docile people or having this knowledge, but they were considered savage and inherently inferior. And the color of your skin basically determined that, basically your role is just to be a slave, pretty much, was what started to happen. And this would go on for, of course, we know, centuries. Eventually, this kind of takes us just to go into this towards the United States. The U.S. would gain its independence from Great Britain with the world's first war of national liberation, inscribing on its banner life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, this was very, of course, for just really a section of the population, and especially for slaves, this most definitely didn't include them. And at this time, there was 450 to 500,000 slaves that were most definitely not included into this Declaration of Independence. The question of slavery itself would tear the country apart, as the decrepit slave system in the South and the nascent capitalism in the North were at complete odds with each other. Eventually, open civil war would break out between the North and the South, basically expressing itself of two different modes of exploitation, with wage slavery in the North and, of course, chattel slavery in the South. That's basically what the Civil War would clash on. It's as Lincoln said at the time, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He continued, "I believe the government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other," which was a very true statement by Lincoln. And at first, the Civil War, for the North's part, was waged on a vague, just trying to preserve the Union lines. And in fact, they were actually losing the war a little bit because of this. But through the course of events in the Civil War, the war would transform into a war against the slave mode of exploitation. Lincoln was really forced by events to sign the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and then a revolutionary war was waged against the slave system, with former slaves playing a very key role in this process. As Du Bois described it as, it was a general strike against the slave system, end quote. Hundreds of thousands of slaves fled the plantation en masse, and around 180,000 former slaves would join the Union Army. And after the North's victory, which, by the way, 4 million people that were formerly slaves had now become free, which was a very significant development. After the North's victory, though, you had the period known as Reconstruction take place, and even experienced a radical phase which granted former slaves full bourgeois democratic rights, such as including the ability to vote and become U.S. citizens on paper. And this was pretty substantial. Just think about it. You had black Republican politicians that emerged in this period, and this is in a part of a country that literally a decade or 2 decades ago, you were a slave. That is definitely a pretty astonishing thing that had taken place. But of course, this was only able to really happen because the federal government, the North, was enforcing this onto the South, basically. However, though, Reconstruction would come to an end which is known as the Rotten Compromise of 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes, the president at the time, he had pulled the Northern troops out of the South. And the reason why this was done is because it was no longer in the Northern capitalist interest to keep occupying the South in that way. They had other interests that they wanted to go upon. Their main interest at the time was to break up that pre-capitalist mode of exploitation of chattel slavery, which they had done. They broke it up, and then there was really no more interest for them to continue this phase, especially with some of the direction that it was going in. Their material interests were more in line with basically going towards a Western expansion at the time. That's where their material interest started going. So this would leave former slaves to the mercies of the former slave masters, who would establish black codes, which would later become Jim Crow, to keep African Americans in a state of bondage under a new form. It's as if basically now, yes, they were completely now under wage slavery, but you basically now still had the slave form under that sort of form. You had things like sharecropping, basically putting African farmers on perpetual debt. You had, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a Supreme Court ruling that had ruled separate but equal, basically saying it is okay for segregation. That was legalized in 1896. So these were things that had been done. Now to continue, in the late 1800s, something that I was just kind of getting to, 80% of the black population had lived in rural areas, but the terror of the KKK, because that also had emerged in that period after the Civil War, lynchings, lack of jobs, opportunities, lack of housings, and of course the Jim Crow that I had just mentioned that was established had made life for African Americans a living hell in the South, and many decided to migrate into major cities in the North. Starting in 1910 to 1940, you had the first Great Migration, which saw 1.5 to 1.6 million Africans migrate to cities such as New York City, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. And this was a pretty significant development because it had created strengthened hundreds of thousands of African Americans to becoming working class, i.e. it had created a black proletariat in the US, which would play a significant role in the coming strike wave that took place in the 1930s. They would African Americans would play an important role of organizing union drives, rank and file militancy, combating racism, and fighting for integration into the main trade unions. For example, the CIO, which had emerged from this massive period of class struggle at the time, had around a membership of 200,000 African Americans inside of it, where the African Americans were in key industries such as steel, auto, and meat packing houses. So that was a pretty significant development, fighting for that integration of black people into the unions. The Great Depression also takes place around this time, as comrades might know, which had hit African Americans especially hard. For example, African American unemployment was around 50% in most US cities. That is very drastic. And African Americans were often last hired but first fired. And African Americans would also play an important role in organizing the unemployed when this Great Depression was taking place, which were often led by the communists. The CPUSA had like a membership, I think, when it came to black workers, it was like 2,000, and they would play a role in it. The CPUSA actually did play somewhat of a role in that strike wave, encompassing also black workers at the head of some of these struggles. But ultimately, the first great wave of migration, to kind of get back to the point, what it had done was, by further creating a black proletariat and through this massive wave of class struggle, would lay the basis for class unity between white and black workers in a general sense. Because of that massive wave of class struggle, the class moving together, that is what allowed basically black and white workers to see that they have fundamental interests connected to one another, that the bosses are the ones that are basically imposing that on the workers. So that was a significant development. There is a big however here, and the however is this. Africans, whether you were in the North or in the South of the country, still faced massive discrimination. They were still lynched, race riots even taking place in this period, and Jim Crow laws that were, of course, mostly confined in the South was a part of daily life. And eventually, those would be tackled. Those demands for democratic rights would be tackled by the civil rights movement. But the struggles in the 30s would lay a very important foundation for that future movement. And this takes us inevitably to World War II, where, again, same thing, African Americans, whether you're at home or abroad, you still face racism, you still face segregation. They were often in segregated units, were brutally discriminated against, were often put in menial support roles, and got worse equipment than their white counterparts. They had fought fascism abroad, and they were being told you're upholding democracy and freedom. But then, of course, especially if you're African American, what freedom, what democracy are you talking about when you were considered a second-class citizen in the U.S.? That's the sort of thing that was happening. So you were being denied these sorts of things that you were being told to uphold. And I'll say, of course, that also applies to the general working class as a whole. But that was definitely a big question mark that African Americans would have, is the fact where it's like, yeah, you're fighting, for democracy and freedom, but yet you're completely denied this at home. And also, of course, the post-war boom after World War II did see significant rise in living standards for basically most Americans, most workers as well. In the beginning, and I will go back to this point later, but in the beginning, it did exclude most African American workers and farmers because of the conditions of Jim Crow and basically the restrictions that were imposed on African Americans. That is why those massive gains that were made were kind of restricted at first, which we'll get back into that in a second. This, alongside all the accumulated anger, which is really a product that ultimately stems back from slavery, the discontent bubbling from this unresolved question, you were freed, but yet you were a second-class citizen in the United States, and the struggles in the 30s, as I said before, would later give rise to the civil rights movement, especially in the South. And before I get into the movement itself, I do want to list some particulars. I've been giving a lot of generals about the situation, but I do want to go into the particular facts of what it was like for African Americans during this period. So African Americans were basically barred from voting. They were forced to take literacy tests, poll taxes, and even a so-called grandfather clause. That's the sort of restrictions that they were putting on African Americans in order for them not to vote in these elections, basically. And for example, in Mississippi, in 1940, 3 to 5% of black adults were registered to vote. So that shows the sort of terror that was placed on African Americans to not vote, and the restrictions there as well. All aspects of public life were segregated. What's this mean? That means schools, buses, restaurants, hospitals, libraries, and even cemeteries were basically divided between blacks, or what they would sometimes put colored or white, basically. This was, of course, mostly confined in the South, but the North would also have similar things to this, but not inscribed in the law books. But anyways, Plessy versus Ferguson, again, bringing back to this 1896 Supreme Court ruling, had inserted separate but equal. But this was clearly not the case, as black facilities were often underfunded, overcrowded, and inferior to white facilities in every which way. Just look at this one example. In Clarendon County, South Carolina, per student spending for white children was $179, while for black children it was $43. So that shows you the sort of massive discrepancy that reigned in that field. Economically in the South, 60% of black workers worked in agriculture, but most of them were trapped by perpetual debt due to sharecropping, because that's what that system had basically put on the African Americans that were involved in that. And black median family income was half that of white families nationally. And in the South, it was even lower. And this is a fact that still exists to a certain extent today. There's still a huge discrepancy between black and white median family income, which shows you that it's a systemic thing for ultimately, basically. Black unemployment was usually double that of white workers, and usually generally higher than the general population's unemployment, which, by the way, is the exact same case pretty much today, which we'll get later into. And racial terror, as I was mentioning, was very rampant in this period. You had KKK and white mobs that would basically lynch black people. For example, 1882 to 1968, there was 3,445 documented lynchings of black people. And by the way, if you were to basically put things that weren't documented, that number, of course, would be significantly higher, but they weren't recorded. So those are the conditions, comrades, very, very brutal conditions. Those are the conditions, plus diminishing opportunities in the South that would create another great wave of migration between 1940 to 1970, and had seen over 5 million African Americans move to Northeast, Midwest, and Western cities. You had now half of the African American population living in cities before the civil rights movement would take off, which plays a key role in showing you how the radicalization process would take place during that period. It would begin in the mid-1950s, and as I said before, it was a continuation of the struggles from the preceding periods. And you had this Supreme Court case that took place at the time called Brown versus Board of Education, which had basically, in 1954, which had said that segregation in schools was unconstitutional, which I would say this sort of thing, of course, happening was not because the Supreme Court basically said, oh, here's this now, and that was the end of it, but it was really having to be won on the streets, and that's ultimately where it had to be secured, was for the civil rights movement to have to enact that in the streets. But really what had happened was there was pressure from below to have to basically put something like this forward. So just want to make sure there's no confusion there. It wasn't the Supreme Court, but it was through actual genuine basically class struggle of the working black workers and their white allies having to mobilize in the streets to actually secure these things. You had, and ultimately too, of course, the civil rights movement, what is it? Just so comrades can get that. What it really was is, of course, it was a struggle for the fight for democratic rights. Because again, just listen to the conditions I said before, 3 to 5% being able to vote in 1940 Mississippi. That is absolutely abhorrent conditions. Of course, the first expression that's going to happen is for black Americans to want to fight for democratic rights, because of the fact where it's like you're completely denied that at first. You had the murder of Emmett Till in August 1955, and the arrest of Rosa Parks in December 1955 for not giving up her seat to a white person. And these would be catalyzing events which would eventually spark into the Montgomery bus boycott, which would be led by Martin Luther King Jr. The boycott would last for 385 days, which showed the degree of anger that there was in the streets there in Alabama. His house was bombed as well. King's house was bombed, and he was arrested during this period. That shows you the massive resistance that was being faced by the movement, the civil rights movement. The boycott had shot MLK into a national figure for the civil rights movement, and he would play a key role in the movement. He would go to help other actions, such as other boycotts that would happen, student-led sit-ins, such as the Greensboro sit-in in 1960, voting drives, and mass marches and rallies, including, of course, one of King's biggest marches and rallies that I know comrades are probably familiar with, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. That's where he delivered his I Have a Dream speech, and that was, of course, one of his biggest events that he had done. King, he would leave this important impact on the earlier stages of the movement as he advocated for nonviolent and peaceful demonstrations, and ultimately was looking for a fair redistribution of wealth, and of course was trying to secure democratic rights, but was not ultimately leading towards wanting a revolution. In 1961, he had said, and he would say things similar to this many times over in the coming years. He said, call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for God's children. He actually even read Marx at one point, but he had drew the conclusion that he didn't agree with the analysis fundamentally. So as Marxists, this would classify MLK as a kind of reformist, pretty much. And King, but I would say this, though, to King's credit, throughout the civil rights movement, though, he would radicalize even further and was moving towards socialist ideas. But I would say, of course, however, he never really drew the need for a socialist revolution or a revolution. He was cut across from that process. It's important to note, though, that in this period, the civil rights movement, by all these actions that had been done, it had gained a lot of legal victories. For example, it gained the Civil Rights Act of 1964 victory, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. These are sort of the gains that were created from this period. And during the post-war boom, to go back to post-war boom, now that these sorts of legal victories were won, and the post-war boom, of course, had lasted for decades, as we know, Black workers did see a significant growth, did see a significant growth to living standards. However, economically still, things didn't fundamentally improve for African Americans, and they still were in effect pretty much second-class citizens. Even though they had basically smashed those legal walls, they still remain that pretty much. And King would state this in 1966, and I think this is pretty significant. He said, "You can't talk about solving the economic problem of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending the slums without saying profit must be taken out of the slums. You're really tampering and getting on dangerous ground because you're messing with folk then. You are messing with captains of industry. Now this means that we are treading in difficult water because it really means that we are saying that something is wrong with capitalism." And I would say, of course, King has a profound truth here, that you are saying something is wrong with capitalism. But the thing is that this billion-dollar question, so to speak, that King is talking about, can this be achieved under the foundations of capitalism? Can this be achieved for African Americans or even the working class under capitalism to improve the sort of problems that plague the African American community? And I would say that the answer is that ultimately, no. It's not that you can't achieve these things under capitalism. Of course, you might be able to, of course, fight for a piecemeal reform and things like that, and of course, communists aren't opposed to that. But ultimately, when it comes to being able to transform people's lives fundamentally, the only way for that to be answered is to tackle capitalism itself. I.e., you need a revolution to do that, not just simple reforms. But to go back to King and for his credit, he also opposed the Vietnam War, which was pretty significant as well. And I would say that some civil rights activists, and even, this isn't even surprising, but LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, the president at the time, he distanced himself from King because of this sort of stance that he had against the Vietnam War. He would tie the war back to the poverty that was happening in the United States. And he said this, and is why I'm opposed to the war in Vietnam. He said, "My friends, but it's estimated that we spend $500,000 to kill each enemy soldier, while we spend only $53 for each person classified as poor. And much of that $53 goes for salaries of people that are not poor. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such," which is very true. He also went to support the Memphis sanitation workers strike in 1968, in which he was able to connect the striking workers' demands for better wages and working conditions. So you can see that, better wages and working conditions to the fight for civil rights. Unfortunately, he would be assassinated very shortly after, in 1968, after addressing those workers. Something that's very key to mention, though, that I saved for now, was the fact that you did have layers of the civil rights movement that were already looking past King by this point, by 1968, especially the youth. Layers of the youth were starting to look past Dr. King. Especially by the mid-'60s, they were looking past him, and they were wanting a revolution. They were starting to draw the conclusion that we need a revolution, not just these democratic rights and stuff that we've secured, but a fundamental change in society. In the 50s and 60s, while the civil rights movement is taking place, you have the colonial revolutions sweeping the world in many parts of the world, in Southeast Asia and in Africa. Many young African Americans were paying keen attention to this phenomena. And I would say this, that African American youth and a whole generation of young people were looking towards radical ideas in this period. And they were wanting to achieve something that they were seeing to those struggles abroad. They were wanting that in the United States, ultimately. And people like Malcolm X and a shift towards Black power, which we'll talk more about that phase, was providing an outlet for this aspiration of a revolution achieved by any means necessary. It's important to note that the forces of genuine Marxism were basically non-existent in this period. They were being held together by Ted Grant, but they couldn't play any role in this period. You had Stalinist parties, and you also had the New Left, quote unquote, in the U.S., but no organization was putting forth the genuine ideas of Marxism, which meant that these genuine aspirations of revolutionary change would go towards many different directions and often would go towards confusing directions, which we'll get into. And as we can see, of course, in this period, capitalism wasn't fundamentally overthrown. But let's dive deeper into this process that I'm talking about, this radicalization process, because it does have interesting parallels and, of course, lessons for us to draw today. But this takes us, of course, inevitably to, I mentioned his name, Malcolm X. He was a revolutionary, and he was a big critic of the reformist direction the civil rights movement was going upon. He called the March on Washington, the 1963 march I was talking about earlier, he called it the farce on Washington. He called it a circus/a performance, and he called it an event that was used to appeal to white liberals. That's the way that he saw it. He saw the official leaders of the civil rights movement being, as he called it, house Negroes, i.e. they were people that were basically being people to control the field Negroes, the masses, and their true feelings and aspirations. And for example, what he was talking about and what he was using was the fact that they blocked more radical speeches. They were supposed to have James Baldwin speak at the 1963 march. They blocked him from speaking. And there was actions that were being discussed. In effect, actions as such as like occupying Washington, D.C. were being discussed, occupying the streets, occupying Washington, D.C. airport, but those things were walked down or backed down on. And Malcolm X was a big critic of that, and he was also, of course, he also said something around the lines of like, the march was infiltrated, was the way he also put it as well, just to give that. As I said before, layers of the youth were moving past King and the other leaders' reformism, and they wanted a revolution. And Malcolm X's uncompromising attitude and the talk, because he would talk about revolution, it definitely left its mark on this layer. Just listen to this, him talking about revolution. Quote, "Revolution is never based on begging somebody for an integrated cup of coffee. Revolutions are never fought by turning the other cheek. Revolutions are never based upon love your enemy and pray for those who despitefully use you. And revolutions are never waged singing, 'We shall overcome,'" which was the song that was sung at the Washington 63 march. "Revolutions are based on bloodshed. Revolutions are never compromising. Revolutions are never based upon negotiations. Revolutions are never based upon any kind of tokenism whatsoever. Revolutions are never even based upon that which is begging a corrupt society or a corrupt system to accept us into it. Revolutions overturn systems, and there is no system on this earth which has proven itself more corrupt, more criminal than this system." So you can see how this can leave a big mark on this radicalizing young layer of African Americans. They're like, I want that, what Malcolm X is talking about. And yeah, Malcolm X, he was coming in age in the periods of the 40s and the 50s, this period that was happening. And it's clear he had really amazing revolutionary instincts. However, there's something I must note here as well, is that there was a vast vacuum in American politics. You see, there's a similarity there. A vast vacuum in American politics. The official unions, the AFL and the CIO, accepted capitalism, which led them to accepting segregation and racism, and also allowed them to accept imperialism abroad. The U.S., of course, was doing things in Vietnam at this time. That was their latest adventure. So that's what the unions were offering. So this is definitely not a genuine outlet for black liberation. The CPUSA, the Communist Party, due to its Stalinist degeneration, and all it was doing in this period was tail-ending the Democrats, also provided no outlet for black liberation at all. Due to this vacuum, Malcolm X would join the Nation of Islam in 1952, and he set about building that organization, which the Nation of Islam was a small Islamic sect putting forward the ideas of black nationalism. He would go towards the youth, Malcolm X, he would go towards the youth boldly and make them question long-held beliefs and have them thinking about racism very critically. The Nation of Islam would go from 1,200 members in 1953 to 6,000 in 1955, which shows you basically the immense growth it had. And then it would go from, in 1961, to an estimated membership of 50,000 to 75,000 people joining it. So, and I would say a large part of this, of course, was due to Malcolm X and the way that he approached the work. And I would say this also about Malcolm X. He had all the qualities I would say a revolutionary must have. He was firm on his principles, withstood any attacks from the establishment, was able to speak truth to power, and he was filled with conviction for his cause, and that conviction came out in transmitting his message. Malcolm X, he would become a national figure for fighting racism and oppression due to these qualities and in actions. For example, there was an action that took place in 1957 where he had mobilized hundreds of Nation of Islam members and non-Nation of Islam members to basically get one of the members of the nation medical attention after getting their head bashed in by the police. That was something that definitely left a mark on this layer of people. But to kind of go back into the Nation of Islam to talk more about it, it played no role in the civil rights movement because it didn't want to play a role in the civil rights movement, or I would say the top leadership didn't want to play a role in the civil rights movement. They didn't want to get involved with it. This inevitably would lead to a clash with the top leadership against Malcolm X, and he would leave the organization in 1964. And the thing is, of course, Malcolm X, he was a black nationalist for most of his life. And in the last year of his life, he would travel across various African countries. And then he started to adopt more of an internationalist perspective from these travels. He started to also see that the struggle for black liberation in America tied inexorably to the colonial revolutions that were taking place across the globe. He started to see these connections. And he also would say this, quote, "It is incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict of black against white, or as purely an American problem." He would go further. He said, "Rather, we are seeing today a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, the exploited against the exploiter," which is very significant. This is somebody they used to call all white people white devils and things like that. And probably there was never any good white person except for John Brown. He would go to saying stuff like this. But now he had adopted more of a class perspective on the question, which was very significant for where he had started. He was going towards socialist ideas and even was looking towards the Socialist Workers' Party. He would speak at some of their events, and he praised the SWP paper. Unfortunately, though, that organization had long ago degenerated politically and was completely incapable of convincing Malcolm X of Marxism. They tail-ended black nationalism, the very ideology that Malcolm X was moving away from. And I'll give a concrete example of this from his own words, Malcolm X. He said this, he said, "I had to do a lot of thinking and reappraising of my definition of black nationalism. Can we sum up the solutions to the problems confronting our people as black nationalism?" And he leaves that question open. And then he said, "If you noticed, I haven't been using the expression for several months." So he himself was starting to have a critical thinking and process about what he really thought black nationalism was, or if that was really the solution for the African-American masses. He started really questioning that. He also was asked in May 1964 to kind of just give comrades more context about him moving towards socialist ideas. He was also asked in 1964 which economic and political system he supported. And he said, "I don't know, but I'm flexible." As was stated earlier, all the countries that are emerging today from under the shackles of colonialism are turning towards socialism. I don't think it's an accident. Most of the countries that were colonial powers were capitalist countries, and the last bulwark of capitalism today is America. It's impossible for a white person to believe in capitalism and not believe in racism. You can't have capitalism without racism, and if you find one and you happen to get that person into a conversation and they have a philosophy that makes you sure they don't have this racism in their outlook, usually they're socialist or their political philosophy is socialism. So he was starting to engage with socialist ideas, and he started moving towards an internationalist position by the end of his life. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to really become a fully conscious socialist, and also he would be assassinated on February 21st, 1965, with the US government likely knowing about it. His boldness, the conviction, the unwavering attitude, and uncompromising war he waged on racism, and I would say on capitalism, it left its mark on this layer, on this radicalizing black layer of youth, and even, of course, others. It still leaves its mark today, as I know, of course, as I mentioned in this room, so many people are inspired by Malcolm X today, which we should be. So, the death of Malcolm X, and also this aforementioned political vacuum that exists in society, and the limitations of the civil rights movement. The most militant sections of the black working class were getting frustrated with where things were at, and they wanted things to go further. Again, I mentioned before, to kind of go back to the civil rights movement, it had achieved equality before the law. It had abolished segregation, in effect, in 1968. It had abolished those laws. It had abolished the second-class citizenship that I was talking about. In law, it had done this. But it had not achieved equality of life, which, for that question, would inevitably lead to having to tackle capitalism and the property relations in order to really challenge those institutional problems at their core, i.e. you would need a socialist revolution to deal with those problems. That would be, of course, the path to go upon. And then when Stokely Carmichael, though, when he announced to the world in 1966, he said, "We've been saying freedom for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. What we got to start saying now is black power. We want black power." For this layer of black militant youth that were starting, the black working class, that was starting to move away from where the civil rights movement were going towards, or they wanted more, this would definitely resonate because they're like, yeah, we want black power, because that sounds like something that is definitely going upon something of like seizing economic and political control. But there's something that also must be mentioned here, and I saved it here because it's very relevant. In the struggle against racism, comrades, there's been two main tendencies. There's been one tendency towards racial integration and equality, and the other for separation and black nationalism. And for the most part, with African Americans becoming more proletarianized, the main tendency that would come out would be for integration and equality. And I mean, you saw this with, of course, the civil rights movement as well. And by the 70s now, you know how I mentioned in the 50s, 50% of the African Americans were living in cities. Now, in 1970s, it was 80% of African Americans lived in cities at this point. However, this process of proletarianization and the general conditions of life over someone's lifetime was slow, and conditions for the African American masses were incredibly intolerable, as the above stated mentioned facts that I gave earlier. These things were intolerable. This would allow black nationalism to gain an appeal to certain layers of black youth and the middle class layers as well. So this announcement towards black power was a shift going towards that direction, towards black nationalism. And it was a break with the mainstream civil rights movement. But I will say there's a positive kernel here, though. And here's the positive kernel, comrades, was the fact that it was wanting to go further than the democratic rights. This layer of people were wanting to go further. In effect, some were even wanting to go towards, of course, socialism, which kind of brings us to the Black Panther Party, which I'll talk more about here. Oakland, California. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, they were dissatisfied with where things were going. They pivoted towards black power. They wanted to defend black people from police brutality, and they wanted a revolution in effect. So they created the Black Panther Party for self-defense in October 1966, which really was an encapsulation of going towards black power. The party would quickly go from formation to its peak. Just within 3 years, just to give some context, by 1969, it was estimated they had about 5,000 members, which definitely, you know, is a pretty big explosion. 5,000 members nationally. For example, this is an organization that just started in Oakland, California. So, you know, for it to turn nationally to 5,000 members is pretty incredible. They had a circulation of their paper, the Black Panther, which had, in 1970, had a circulation of 250,000 copies, so that's pretty good. And even layers of the party, of the Black Panthers, as I mentioned before, were reaching socialist conclusions. They would draw socialist conclusions, and they were even open to Marxism, which I want to really emphasize this point, that it's a very big thing, that these young militants were open to Marxism. If you kind of see the through line that I've been giving from MLK, Malcolm, to the Black Panthers, you could see that is a pretty substantial development. It showed you how consciousness was developing in this period, basically, in essence. For example, Bobby Seale, the co-founder, one of the co-founders, he stated, "We don't fight exploitative capitalism with black capitalism, we fight capitalism with basic socialism." So you could see that there was a questioning and basically a certain direction that was being taken. Thousands of young people would organize in the Black Panthers, comrades, and were fighting to build a revolutionary organization. It is a very inspiring history, it really is, and I definitely encourage comrades to read Marxism and the Black Panther Party because it goes more into it. However, there were also a serious number of limitations that need to be addressed with the Black Panther Party, and I'll go into it here. First and foremost, the party was ideologically confused and eclectic. There wasn't an older generation of Marxists to train these revolutionaries. They weren't present. They were juggling many different ideologies from Maoism, Stalinism, black nationalism, elements of Trotskyism, and many, many others. And they did have a black nationalist leaning. I did mention there was layers that moved towards socialist conclusions, but it still did have a black nationalist leaning. For example, Stokely Carmichael, the individual I listed before, in 1966, he would become the prime minister of the party in 1968, and this would kind of be this would isolate some of these militant young African Americans. It would isolate the Panthers from this broader process that was taking place of these other advanced young workers and youth, including other young African Americans as well. It didn't have a clear sense of direction, engaging in a multitude of things, ranging from mutual aid to screening sickle cell anemia, breakfast programs, etc. They didn't have a cohesive national leadership team, nor did they have democratic structures as well, which is big as well. At times, they would also engage in stunts and provocations. For example, Huey P. Newton, the co-founder in 1967, he was part of a shootout with a police officer, you know. This on top of the fact that the FBI's COINTELPRO had made a concerted effort to stop the party from getting onto a firm foundation was also big. Edgar Hoover, who was the FBI director at the time, he had said that the Black Panther Party, without question, represents the greatest threat to internal security of the country. And the FBI would deliberately pit Panthers against Panthers. They would murder them as well, but the reason why this was done to a very successful degree, comrades, is because the lack of ideological cohesion. State repression alone is not enough to destroy an organization. The Bolsheviks were under a vast state repression from Tsarism. They were able to survive because they had that initial nucleus of cadres that were able to hold the party together under those very, very difficult conditions. The Black Panther Party had no such thing. So basically the FBI was able to exploit these already apparent cracks to the maximum. So eventually the Panthers, they would have a split in 1971. The split would cascade into further splits and crises for the party, and the real opportunity to reach the black working masses and masses in general wasn't able to be realized. And eventually the Black Panther Party would dissolve in 1982. What was one perceived as the greatest threat to the internal security of the US was reduced to nothing. And before we move on from the Panthers, I do want to pay attention to one specific Panther, Fred Hampton, who was the deputy chairman of the Black Panther Party and the chair of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. He was such a figure that provoked fear from the ruling class. He had all the aforementioned traits of a revolutionary that I mentioned before, just like Malcolm X. And he was clear about the class divide in society. He would state things like, saying stuff like, "We don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water best. We're going to fight racism not with racism. We're going to fight with solidarity. We say we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism." He would continue, "We're going to fight their state authorities and police reactions with all of us people getting together and having an international proletarian revolution." So he would say things pretty clear. He also had created a coalition of other groups at the time that were radicalizing, such as the Young Patriots and Young Lords, and et cetera, called the Rainbow Coalition, that were radicalizing from all the events that are happening around the world. Just to give context, comrades, this is 1968, May 68 in France, the biggest general strike taking place in that country, or I think still to date, over 10 million workers. The death of MLK, as I mentioned before, there was riots that took place at that time as well. The anti-Vietnam War movement gaining more steam at that time, and the 1968 Democratic Convention happening as well. All those sorts of things were happening that were radicalizing this youth. And this coalition was seen as a clear anti-capitalist coalition. And he was firmly opposed to today what we call identity politics. And he was trying to fight for the unity of all oppressed people across racial lines, as what this coalition was trying to accomplish. The FBI, they had made a note. They said they wanted to prevent the rise of a black messiah. And what this really means is trying to prevent a political force that would be able to tie black struggle to the broader class struggle and unite black, white, and all other ethnicities against the ruling class. That's what that term meant when they said prevent the rise of a black messiah. By these actions of the Rainbow Coalition, and speaking in clear class terms, Fred Hampton was a clear threat. He fit the bill, so to speak, for the FBI. And eventually he was assassinated at the age of 21, very, very young, on December 4th, 1969, with the help of an FBI informant, which was a direct kill that was made by the state to cut across his revolutionary life short. Before he could really make a study of Marxist ideas, in spirit, he was a genuine proletarian revolutionary, and he still is obviously a big inspiration for revolutions today, including, obviously, we saw in this room, and including for myself. We should keep these words in mind from him when we march forward, when we keep building our party, comrades. He said this: "If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. If you dare not struggle, then God damn it, you don't deserve to win." I think that's definitely some apt lines that we can keep while we go forward. Now, I know I went through a whirlwind of things, comrades, of the civil rights movement. And it was, of course, there's a lot of things that had happened in that period. But what is the balance sheet to draw from this period? You could see that the youth, especially in the late 60s and 70s, were moving towards revolutionary conclusions. And as I mentioned before, the through line, just look at the through line, MLK, from basically fighting for democratic rights to Fred Hampton, basically talking about international proletarian revolution and for socialism. These are very big things that shows you the massive radicalization process that had taken place, i.e. revolutionary conclusions were drawn. And we live in very similar conditions today, comrades. Those conditions that had molded and steeled Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, and led to the creation of the Black Panther Party are here today on a higher level. Malcolm X, the Panthers, Fred Hampton, they weren't able to come to fully fledged Marxist conclusions, and this is no fault of their own. I would say that the blame squarely lands with the Stalinists dissolving the Comintern in 1943, and the CPUSA in this country played no role. It was absolutely, basically left a disgusting smell for any person that was looking for genuine black liberation. That's because of the Stalinist generation. The SWP as well, which after Trotsky's death had made political and theoretical mistake after mistake, that also had no appeal for young black people. And in fact, they were just tail-ending black nationalism rather than connecting the black struggle with the need for social revolution and seeking to win people over to that approach. So those are where I would say the blame squarely lands. As seen in this period, comrades, there was boldness, self-sacrifice, and courageous fighters. Although these things are important and needed, this is not enough to overthrow capitalism. What's needed is clear ideas, a program, a method of understanding capitalism, racism, and how to effectively fight them and abolish them, which Marxism provides, which we've been discussing. But you must also build a party on the basis of these ideas, programs, and methods. It's hard and it's painstaking work, but absolutely necessary to build an effective force of professional revolutionaries that can be rooted in every neighborhood, school, and workplace. It is absolutely needed. When the struggle was hitting its fever pitches in this period, comrades, it never lacked boldness, it never lacked a courageous spirit, it never lacked fire, passion, sacrifice. What it lacked was a comprehensive party of Marxists, of trained cadres who could link the black struggle to the broader class struggle and for the need for the working class to take economic and political power. That's what it was. So the key lesson, if I had to basically sum it up in a sentence, the key lesson of this epoch was the need to build a genuine revolutionary party on the basis of Marxism in advance of those explosions. And that's something that could have been done and could have changed the whole situation. History keeps showing this lesson over and over again. It keeps showing it. And we, the RCI and RCA, we're taking it seriously, and we won't let this epoch slip through our hands. We'll build this force that's necessary to bury the system that had murdered Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, and so many others. We're going to bury it, comrades. And to continue, to get into my last remarks, where do things stand now for African Americans since the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power phase? Generally speaking, things from the preceding periods of struggle, the Civil Rights Movement, stuff like that, things have improved for the quality of life for African Americans in many important ways. It had further integrated African Americans into American society, but there still remains a significant gulf in income, living standards, and life outcomes between blacks and white workers. For example, black unemployment, as I mentioned before, is approximately 7.5%, which is close to double the official unemployment of 4.3%. Youth unemployment is even higher, standing at 13.3% for ages 20 through 24, about 24% higher than the average of 10.5%. Infant mortality and general youth mortality are significantly higher, or basically double to triple higher than the general mortality for these figures. And the reason why is because it stems from, of course, systemic causes from capitalism: fewer healthcare providers, pharmacies, hospitals, and generally lower quality of all three. Black poverty rate has risen in recent years. In 2022, it was 17.1%. In 2024, it was 18.4%, a 1.3% increase, which shows you basically how much it had gone up. And the official poverty rate is 10.6%. So that basically, African American poverty rate is significantly higher. And inflation in the past year has decreased black household income by 3.3%, while white non-Hispanic households saw their income effectively unchanged. So you can see here that racism is interwoven into capitalism, in the capitalist system completely. These discrepancies can't be solved in the framework of capitalism. You see how I'm talking about almost the same figures from basically almost 50, 70 years ago. It's because, again, the capitalist system cannot solve these questions. That's why we're still talking about these issues. You can't solve these problems that are caused by the system that has, of course, rich and poor, that deliberately divides working class by arbitrary lines like the color of your skin in order for capitalists to extract massive profits. As I mentioned before, racism is a byproduct of the capitalist system. It was created to divide the oppressed amongst each other in order for the capitalists to extract massive profits. Today, capitalism finds itself in an existential crisis, and the capitalists will attempt to whip up this poison of racism and xenophobia, which is a type of racism pretty much, to the nth degree in order to prevent the unity of the working class. Revolutionary communists fight for the utmost unity of the working class and oppose all forms of oppression imposed by the capitalists. The working class has no interest in maintaining any of these poisonous symptoms of capitalism. In fact, they have all the interest to oppose all these poisons and attack straight at the root cause, which is capitalism. Any attempts by the ruling class to divide the working class should be opposed, but also any attempt to abandon the class point of view while ignoring the root cause, which is class society itself, capitalism, should also be opposed as well. And I would say this, in effect, is identity politics that can maybe recognize various oppressions that happen under capitalism, but completely detach it from the class struggle and help isolate these struggles into their own sort of particular bubbles. For example, there's like this notion where it's like only black people can speak on black oppression, and I'll talk on this real quick. The thing is, the people under capitalism are divided into antagonistic classes, of course, the capitalists and the proletariat, as we've been talking about. So trying to say that only black people can speak on black oppression, what tends to happen, basically what happens is that the black capitalists get to basically dictate how and what the actual basically struggles of black people and stuff like this are. And that basically cuts across what the actual majority, the actual proletariat think on this question, basically. Again, do the interests of like someone like Oprah Winfrey or Obama and these sorts of people have the same fundamental interests connected to black proletarians? I absolutely don't think at all. Not even for 1 second. These things must be connected. Again, we can't diverge them from the class point of view. It has to be tied to the class struggle. But of course, just to add these 2 points as well, communists, we do recognize that there are oppressions that do predate capitalism, like, of course, women's oppression, and we don't ignore these oppressions. That's, of course, one of the main reasons why we're having this discussion on black struggle. But we have to understand the root cause. What is the root cause? It's capitalism. That is what the root cause is of causing, again, racism, and I talked about, of course, how it came into being. So you can see the reactionary role that identity politics can play in the class struggle here. The ruling class of every class society utilizes divide and rule tactics in order to maintain the rule. Never, ever will the oppressed classes be free if they help the class enemy, i.e. the very people they're at war with, if they help them in this effort to divide the class. They will never be free. Class unity and class struggle is how we'll ultimately bury these dividing lines the capitalists utilize to divide us. The ruling class is starting to increasingly find it harder to rule, and the masses are increasingly finding it difficult to live. And this is giving rise to a new generation that's entering onto the scene and wanting to, of course, tackle these things. They're brushing aside the divisions that the ruling class throws at them, but they're also, of course, more skeptical of identity politics, which is why I brought it up. If you're someone that's 18 years old, you're a one-year-old when the 2008 financial crisis hit, which further added dynamite to the foundations of the capitalist system. Then when you were 4 years old, you had the Occupy Wall Street movement and the aspiring Arab Spring happening in 2011. When you were 6 years old in 2013, you had the emergence of Black Lives Matter, the movement, once again putting racism and police brutality front and center, which once again shows, comrades, the fact that this question cannot be solved under capitalism, the fact that we're still, of course, talking about this question. It's rooted inevitably to capitalism and can only be smashed with capitalism going away too. To continue though, at the age of 9, you had the election of Donald Trump when you're in 2016. When you were 12 years old, in 2019, you had the revolutionary wave sweeping the world, various parts of the world. Now, why I gave this preface, we get into 2020. You were 13 years old, and this marked a big turning point for the capitalist system. Again, you're only 13 years old. I of course, obviously did a speed run of the above stuff, but you're only 13 years old. Look at the instability that's going on. And by the way, it didn't stop at all. You had a global pandemic, which had further revealed the cracks of the capitalist system, the inability of the capitalists to solve that crisis. And you had the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, which for many, as we saw in this room, was a radicalizing event and revealed the deep-seated rage against the system which boiled onto the streets. The MSPD, the Minneapolis Police Department, had thought it was going to be business as usual after the killing. They had written it off as a medical accident and had said George Floyd showed restraint and wanted to call it a day. That was all that they were going to do on this question. George Floyd, he was pinned down for 9 minutes, 29 seconds by Derek Chauvin, the police officer. The video of him being killed reached millions of people incredibly fast after his killing. And unfortunately, comrades, police killings like this are not uncommon in the U.S. In fact, in 2024, 1,365 people were killed by the police. Black people were 2.9 times as likely to be killed than white people. And something that I think is very significant to note is the fact that in 2019, the latest figure of police killings, it was 1,099 police killings, which means the number has gone up, which means it's a bigger issue today than it even was 5 years ago. So that's very significant to note. And the fact is this too, less than 2% of these killings actually face persecution. I mean, it took a whole mass movement to even get the Derek Chauvin guy for him to face any repercussions. But nonetheless, 2% of these fatal killings by the police basically don't only get actionable. So that shows you the sorts of they can just do this with basically free reign. The cumulative buildup, though, from everything, from the period that I mentioned above, the living standards declining, the pandemic, and the lack of response, and more, was too much for the masses this time, though. They didn't let this one police killing go away. And in fact, the very next day in Minneapolis, there was a protest. Hundreds quickly became thousands. And on May 28th, the police precinct, the 3rd police precinct, was completely overrun by the masses and abandoned, and it was set on fire, which is a complete act of insurrection. 54% of the population had basically agreed that that was a justifiable act at the time. Within days, the movement had engulfed most major cities in the U.S. and even spread internationally to over 60 countries. In the U.S., the George Floyd movement was the largest mass movement to date and had brought an estimated 15 to 26 million people out to the streets, an approximation of 10% of the U.S. population. And the demonstrations were not just African Americans, but encompassed all ethnicities, all layers of society, which is very significant. It shows you the sort of burning hatred that millions of people have for racism. The ruling class, they used might and main to try to paint the demonstrations as violent and looters, and they tried to isolate the protesters, but to no avail. It didn't work. In fact, the portrayal by the media and Donald Trump himself added more fuel to the fire. Donald Trump had said something around the lines, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. That definitely wasn't any calming sentiment, but most definitely inflamed the movement. In fact, on May 29, 2020, Trump was forced to go underground in a bunker due to these demonstrations in DC at the time. And this was completely unprecedented. The masses had felt their strength, and when the masses were on the streets, the usual dividing tactics of the ruling class completely fell flat. In fact, I would say that racism today is at a weak point due to all the mistrust of the establishment and the general disgust for racism, as you can see by this display of 15 to 26 million people out on the streets on this question. And when the masses mobilize and struggle, they throw away all the arbitrary lines that the ruling class tries to paint on them. However, within a month, though, or so, the George Floyd uprising, the initial white heat of it would die down. It would dissipate. It will start to dissipate. The masses cannot be mobilized indefinitely, and especially if there's no clear sense of direction and leadership. Spontaneity can only go so far in that regard. And with no path forward, the movement was channeled into the Democratic Party and was defeated shortly after. However, does this mean that nothing gained from the movement? And I would use a Trotsky quote here, where Trotsky said, "History wastes nothing." The George Floyd uprising showed that a new generation of class fighters have arrived on the scene in the belly of the beast. It was the opening shot of the Third American Revolution. That's what the George Floyd uprising was, and it was very significant. So no, it wasn't. There was something to be gained there because it had shown that. The masses had shown tremendous boldness, courage, and defiance, but as shown earlier, that alone is not enough. Although important and needed, the main lesson is the same lesson that was present in the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power period: the need to build a revolutionary party consisting of cadres in advance of these pre-revolutionary/revolutionary explosions based on the ideas of Marxism. Imagine if there was a force in society that could tie the George Floyd uprising to the labor movement and called a general strike until the demands were met. Imagine if the defense committees that were set up in Minneapolis were given more of an impetus to spread regionally and nationally. This would have completely changed the entire character of the movement and would have posed the question, who runs society? Is it the capitalist minority who exploit everybody, or is it the working class that produces everything in society? It would have put that very, very clear. And I could say, of course, we know, which would have been very self-evident if that took place. Of course, though, this opportunity was lost, but we're here today absorbing the lessons on why it didn't go further, as I mentioned before. And how do we achieve victory next time? Because there will be future explosions, comrades. And by the way, yeah, I didn't forget about the 18-year-old, because it seems like I might have left you in the dark. No, let's bring you back. So, if you're someone that's 18 years old, that's all you've seen of the capitalist system is crisis. I would say even if you're someone that's 30 years old, maybe you can even go up to 35, all you've seen is crisis. Debt-ridden, you're just seeing basically this abhorrent situation through and through, and it's getting profoundly worse through and through. So this is what's moving the youth, comrades, is this profound crisis of the capitalist system, and that's what's making them seek radical ideas. It's no coincidence that in this country, something like George Floyd's murder was a lightning rod which channeled all the bubbling discontent in society. 400 years of slavery, Jim Crow, and its lingering effects and institutionalized racism still permeate throughout the whole of American capitalism, and its nasty tendrils, as I said earlier, hang over society in all spheres, as shown before. This will continue to be the case until capitalism is overthrown, meaning we can expect, unfortunately, more police killings of African Americans, more mistreatment, continuing declining living standards, more disenfranchisement, etc. But the reverse is also true, that those very things will continue to stir the working class and youth, particularly black workers and youth, which will lead to further struggles or future struggles, enabling black workers and youth to play an important role in the class struggles to come in this country. And they must inevitably link the struggle against racism to an all-out struggle against the capitalist system with their class brothers and sisters of all ethnicities. The social revolution, comrades, for the first time, will be when the African-American masses can gain true liberation and freedom alongside their class brothers and sisters in the wider working class as a whole. This is the road to achieve what Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, the Panthers, and many more are trying to achieve. Under a workers' government, we'll be able to tackle the most pressing things facing the African-American masses and the working class as a whole. By nationalizing the Fortune 500 companies and democratically planning, we'll be able to provide full employment, high-paying union jobs with union hiring halls, especially in the most impoverished areas, lower the working week, provide free healthcare, free education, affordable housing, and establish public works to help improve living conditions even further. This is the only way to achieve reparations for slavery and to fundamentally improve the position of black workers through workers' democracy and a revolutionary socialist program. On that basis, comrades, when the artificial scarcity of capitalism is abolished and these new social conditions established, this will erode the material basis for racism. And after several generations, racism will wither away completely and prepare for truly human relations to be established amongst all humans. But comrades, the task of our generation is to get organized into a revolutionary party so we can achieve this future where racism and capitalism are abolished, i.e. we must conquer Marxist ideas and organize for our future. That's the task posed for our generation so that we can achieve the future that I talked about before. And I'll end on a W.E.B. Du Bois quote. He said, "In the end, communism will triumph. I want to help bring that day." So comrades, let's continue to build the RCA/RCI so that we can bring this day in our lifetimes.